Welcome to Construction Revolution.
The revolution in the construction industry isn't just coming, it's already started.
This is Construction Revolution.
Construction Revolution.
This is the
This
revolution.
is the revolution.
Construction
Revolution.
Revolution.
Okay, hey everybody, I'm Matthew Newberger. You're watching the Construction Revolution. And I'm here with Anirban Basu, who's going to talk to us a little bit about what's going on in the economy, how's it going to affect construction. But keep in mind that this show is for people that are passionate about the built environment, passionate about the vision for the future, how things are going to transform, and how you need to position yourself, your business, in all of your partnerships so that you can grow and be successful, not just next year, but over the next 10 years. So we'll constantly be bringing you experts from the field, great advice, the latest technology, and even the best economists to talk to you about how you need to do that. So our vision of the future is that the built environment is one of the best places to work and the safest places to work and the most productive places to work. So with that, Anirban, welcome. Thank you for being here today. I appreciate you joining me.
Pleasure.
And we have a little bit of history. We've been working together for a while. I don't know if you recall this, Anirban, but I had a conference in 2011 that you talked at. So it's been appropriately a little over 10 years now since we last got together. But I know you spend a lot of time in the built environment. You work with some great associations like ABC, providing members with an understanding of what's going on. But today we really want to talk about sort of, what's going on in the economy. If I'm in the built environment, what's important for me to know? So I have a lot of questions for you, but maybe we can just start with talking about some of the current economic trends. What are you seeing out there?
I see an economy that's unbalanced. So normally in economics, we expect that demand and supply grow and shrink hand in hand. And that when demand manifests itself, that suppliers will be ready to supply to that demand. And what we've seen since the pandemic began, or at least shortly after the pandemic began, is that for the most part, supply has not been able to keep up with demand. It's strange, accident of history, I guess. The pandemic strikes in early 2020. It's not clear how long the pandemic is going to impact the economy, but people know that we have shut down the economy by March of 2020 into April. And so manufacturers and other producers, distributors, start cutting back on output. They start trimming inventories. They start laying off staff. And part of that was because some of those staff members asked to be laid off so that they could take advantage of more generous unemployment insurance benefits coming out of the federal government. And then all of a sudden, the light switch of the economy turned back on. By May, we were out of recession, May of 2020. We're adding millions of jobs by both May and June of 2020. Demand is stimulated by stimulus packages. Another stimulus package in December of 2020. Then again in March of 2021. Businesses are spending more on equipment because they can't find enough workers and are trying to bolster productivity. And of course, all the while, interest rates and the cost of capital generally are quite low. And so demand for construction services, demand for all manner of services and goods in the economy rises, and the supply chain just can't keep up because the suppliers had cut back on capacity earlier in the pandemic. Now they were trying to hire back workers, and that's proven difficult to this very day.
Wow. So can you think of some specific examples as and we work with some manufacturers, and that what you said is very consistent with what I'm seeing. But are there specific examples you might provide?
Well, many. So, let's take the U.S. auto sector as an example. So last year, General Motors sales declined by double digits. Now, demand for automobiles, demand for vehicles was sky high, but they did not have enough computer chips and spare parts to supply to that demand. Now, Toyota, in an accident of history, had a number of chips and parts on hand. Why? Because in 2011, there was a tsunami and earthquake, not in that order, in Japan. And at that time, that caused a lot of Toyota suppliers to be interrupted in terms of their production cycle. And so all of a sudden, Toyota ran into a problem. Ever since that time, oddly enough, Toyota, which gave us the notion of just-in-time inventory, has been compiling or stocking more inventory. So when the pandemic hit and disrupted all auto producers, all of a sudden Toyota had this inventory of inputs, and they could, in fact, expand their production, which they did. Their sales in America rose 10% last year. And as many people know, Toyota actually sold more vehicles in America than General Motors did for the first time in the 120-year history of that industry. A foreign producer outsold one of the big three. So, it really quite remarkable. If sawmills come to mind as well. So sawmill capacity was truncated early during the pandemic. The Federal Reserve jumps into overdrive, cutting interest rates, increasing bond purchases, driving mortgage rates and other interest rates lower. We come out of the pandemic, all of a sudden there's a desire for housing because people want to social distance. They want more space for home offices and home gyms. They want to move to the suburbs for various reasons. So all of a sudden there's enormous demand for softwood lumber, but the sawmills couldn't keep up with that demand. And even to this day, softwood lumber prices remain quite elevated.
Interesting. So, it's funny, a couple of examples that makes me think of as you were talking to one of our clients who provides lumber. And one of the things that I found interesting is that the world we live in today expects just in time everything. I need a 2x4. I ask for it, I get it, right? But if you take a sawmill that produces 2x4s and you shut it down, most people don't know it takes years to turn it back on, right? But we don't think that way. So are you seeing that things that in construction where we need cement, we need wood, we need materials, we need manufactured goods, are we coming to a place where we're realizing that you just can't get these things as soon as you want them? Is that going to be a trend in the future? Or is that just a short-term pain point due to the pandemic?
Well, the magic word for 2021, of course, was transitory. And really, it's not a bad word. It just people's definition of what is transitory differs. I don't think it's forever. Ultimately, I think economic theory proves itself to be correct, that the quantity supplied rises to meet the quantity demanded. So one of the things that we economists like to say is that the cure for high prices is high prices. Why? Because high prices, whether for steel, aluminum, copper, softwood lumber, concrete slab, whatever it happens to be, is an inducement, a motivator for suppliers to expand capacity, to expand short-term production, including by adding shifts. And so that increased quantity supplied ultimately translates into lower price. And of course, one of the things that we have right now is this unusual economic circumstance where we turn the economy back on. So demand just surged. At some point, that shock to demand will begin to abate and we won't see these imbalances. And so that will produce fewer shortages and lower prices ultimately. And I think that could happen sometime later this year, perhaps late this year. So it's going to get easier. But right now, contractors are facing a shortage of steel and all kinds of other inputs, and of course, workers. And the worker shortage doesn't go away very quickly. That is not especially transitory.
No, and being that that's a business we're in is helping to train and develop managers, leaders, all that. There's a learning curve. Even if you hire them, it doesn't mean that they're ready to work, at least at a high effective level. So I would imagine if things fix themselves in the year in terms of supply and demand imbalances, we probably have another year to solve some of the labor shortage and training and development needs around that. Would that sound right based on other economic cycles you've seen?
Matt, I think it's going to be a lot longer than a year. I mean, this
Wow.
is structural. This is not cyclical. So a couple of things here. So for instance, in our country, immigrants make up or have made up a significant fraction of the construction workforce. There are some measures that suggest that approximately 46% of all roofers are immigrants, right? And also, basic laborers, those kinds of folks tend to be immigrants. Drywallers and painters, heavily immigrant. And so immigration has slowed. And I'm not talking about illegal immigration, I'm talking about legal immigration. But as it turns out, immigration generally has slowed. And one of the other things that happened during the early stages of the pandemic is that a lot of baby boomers retired early during the pandemic, much earlier than people had thought. In fact, much earlier than they had considered. But the pandemic unleashed some desires to retire and some ability to retire by causing the stock market to rise and the housing values to rise as well. And so we just don't have enough workers. And this is not unique to construction, as it turns out. We have a shortage of 80,000 truck drivers in this country. But of course, that also affects construction because materials have to be transported to the job site. So all kinds of things happening here. But ultimately, I think we have a shortage of workers. We have more technology purchased by construction firms to displace those workers because they can't find those workers. productivity advances, and I think the revolution, and we're talking about revolution here today, of course, on this podcast, but I think you will see a revolution in the way that construction services are delivered going forward because of necessity, which is the mother of invention. Not enough work to do the job. Let me find some technology that can.
Yeah. And so do you see specific types of technologies that if you were talking to our audience and saying, hey, look, if you're a general contractor and you can't find project managers, superintendents, what types of technology are you seeing? Are you seeing any trends that are things that people should be looking at because of the longer term labor shortage?
Well, where I really see the shortages are in those skilled trades, among those skilled craftspeople. Our universities, whether Virginia Tech or Penn State or others, graduate a fair number of construction managers. I'm not saying it's enough. I certainly don't think we have enough estimators in this country. And of course, estimation is very challenging when you've got volatile materials prices and labor shortages. But a lot of the issues are plumbers and pipe fitters and roofers and glaziers and those kinds of folks. What I think is that there's going to be investment in material science. New materials will be brought to bear. 3D printing will become more commonplace. In fact, I believe Habitat for Humanity recently 3D printed a house. So this is starting to happen in the United States, and it had been happening for quite some time in other parts of the world. I think you'll see more use of drones to monitor the progress of construction. You see further progress with respect to BIM and 3D modeling, all these kinds of things. You'll see the application of artificial intelligence, augmented reality, all these things to construction as well, whether during the design or actual construction phases. And so the revolution is coming. Driverless vehicles will be driving materials to the job site. All of these things are coming.
Wow. And so for and I'm thinking through the folks that we work with, and we've got you've got the $1 billion plus general contractor who's in several different countries, and you've got down to maybe the pipe fitter or the drywaller or the electrician who's running a $5 to $20 million business. Are these types of technologies we're talking about that they may have to use, such as some of the modeling, drones, things like? Are these things that are going to be affordable at that level, or are some of these folks facing extinction?
Some of them are facing extinction. So one of the things I think, Matt, and I actually just wrote an article about this for a publication out of New England, but that you'll see more consolidation in the construction industry because many of these technologies and the attendant training that's required to deploy these technologies are very expensive. And so often it takes a bigger balance sheet to afford and deploy these technologies. And that's one of the things I think that will drive more mergers and acquisitions going forward. Now, there are other things driving mergers and acquisitions, like the retirement of owners. So you got a lot of baby boomer construction firm owners out there. They don't have family members they can hand the business off to, and so they sell it. And that's a good outcome for them, of course, because a lot of businesses simply die. They're never sold. But in any case, lots of factors driving consolidation, including low interest rates and all this liquidity bouncing around the economy. But one of the factors is the need to be more effective in recruiting talent, and larger firms are more visible and therefore might have an edge in recruitment, and also having a balance sheet that allows one to purchase the latest technologies and to deploy them effectively.
So if somebody's smaller, this is a good time for them to be thinking about, what is my strategy? Am I just going to ride my business out until it no longer works? Do I need to position my business to be attractive for sale? Do I need to go acquire some competitors so that I can get the critical mass I need to invest in the technologies that are going to be forced upon my business in the future? Is that a fair statement?
Oh, it is. I mean, of course, many people will just ride their business until they're done, and then they'll retire that business. I own a business myself. That's what might happen to me. I might ride my economic consulting firm right to the bitter end, and then that's it. No one might choose to purchase it, and that's okay. It's been a source of income, so that's fine, and it's allowed me to do what I love. And I think many contractors, small contractors included, would feel the same way. They love doing what they do. Their businesses allowed them to do that, but it doesn't necessarily translate into a liquidity event at the end of their career. But I think one of the things that smaller contractors in particular think about is merger partners. Can they get bigger? Can they have more of a market presence? Can they expand their marketing without really curtailing their profitability? By having that larger balance sheet and greater capacity? Can they increase their bonding capacity by merging with a firm or acquiring a firm? And many firms are not in a position, they don't have the cash to acquire a firm, but mergers can transpire, with relatively little liquidity required. So in any case, yeah, I think people should be thinking about that.
That sounds good. And even others are maybe even looking at who your employees are that may want to take it over and have the appetite to expand. If you're, you've had a good 30 years in the business, you may not be thinking, hey, I don't necessarily want to take this next wave. The one thing I am hearing loud and clear is everybody across the board right now is going to be facing greater demand for their services in the construction industry. And they're going to deal with constraints with resources, materials, employees. So interesting challenges to have. So are there areas within the industry and the built environment you think are better to be in? So a lot of times I'm going to, when I'm working with a general contractor, as an example, we'll talk about segments where they want to be known or established as one of the best at a project type. So that might be building commercial offices, which probably isn't a hot topic right now, unless you're in a very hot market, versus warehouse, versus data warehouses, versus retail. Are there certain sections that you see some long-term trends being more attractive in the construction industry?
Oh, I mean, we just saw the passage of an infrastructure bill, for instance, signed by Joe Biden, our president, on December 15th. So we know that public work related spending is going to be up over the next few years. And by the way, before the passage of that Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, we had another stimulus package passed. I shouldn't call it infrastructure stimulus necessarily, but we had on March 11th, President Biden signed the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, which, among other things, delivers $350 billion in direct financial aid to state and local governments. So even absent the infrastructure package that was signed 9 months later, state and local governments have had a lot of money, including money that they could spend on infrastructure. But now here comes this infrastructure package. So public projects represents a big win, including things like school construction. It's not all about roads and bridges and broadband. I think many contractors will benefit from things like nitty-gritty school construction, maybe some government office buildings as well. I think also it is the case that e-commerce obviously is one of the most rapidly growing segments of the economy. And so it makes sense that backbones of the e-commerce economy, like data centers and fulfillment centers, will also generate a lot of construction volume going forward. And then finally, we've been in the midst of a pandemic for a couple of years. And so I think you're going to see a fair amount of healthcare related construction spending as well. It's been made pretty clear by the pandemic that we don't have enough inpatient capacity. We haven't had enough room for ICU beds and ventilators. And that also we probably need some more outpatient capacity as well, including as the population gets older. So those are some of the hot segments. The cooler segments: hotels, retail, office, because remote work is a real thing, and that's going to hurt the office market forever, as far as I can tell. The hotel segment will not bounce back quickly because of a lack of business travel formation. And then the retail segment has been clobbered by bankruptcies of True Religion, JCPenney, J. Crew, Brooks Brothers, Neiman Marcus, Francesca's, Pier 1 Imports, and many others. And so lots of vacant retail space out there. That's not good for new construction.
Yeah, those are going to be challenges. That's good to know. What about your Dunkin' Donuts and your these fast casual? Will that be something that we'll see more in retail, or is that's going to be a challenge too?
No, I think the Dunkin' Donuts, Starbucks, CVS's, Walgreens, some of these standalone sites, I think those will be really popular. Wawa, Royal Farms, they operate often out of sort of single, independent, detached structures. I think you'll see a lot of that. America's becoming more suburban, so probably you'll see more Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts as more millennials move to the suburbs. That force was very much unleashed by the pandemic, and so I think that there will be construction of that type in abundance.
Wonderful. Okay, that's good. So we have some clients that will be very interested to hear that. And I think that they're also focused on creating that same experience no matter where you go in the world. And they just seem to be popping up everywhere, whatever that fast casual restaurant food or something like that, but not the big retailers that are, your JCPenney's, your Macy's, those types of things, as I'm hearing it.
Yeah, you're not going to see a lot of new JCPenney's under construction. I don't think you'll see a ton of Barnes and Nobles under construction. The world is changing, and in some sense, it's too bad. I'm from Baltimore, and that Barnes and Noble store in downtown Baltimore was like a palace to me. That's where I spent a lot of my time in downtown Baltimore, and they closed recently during the pandemic, and it's taken away a real amenity. But that's just the reality of things. People are ordering. The new shopping center is people's phones. and so that translates into more data centers and fulfillment centers, but fewer Sears and Kmart's.
Makes sense. So I'm going to go back to the infrastructure bill topic for just a second here. And I'm going to ask about some segments that I'm kind of curious about. Renewables, mainly solar, right? Is it here to stay? And is the infrastructure bill going to support that? Or are we going to be tearing these things down in 6 years?
I think solar and wind is here to stay. Now, like other technologies, underlying equipment has a shelf life and has to be replaced. That's true, but I don't think solar is going away anytime soon. In fact, I would suspect that the fraction of energy or electricity that's produced by solar will continue to grow over the course of time, and wind energy might grow even faster, including offshore wind. Maryland, as it turns out, but the East Coast generally, the folks in New York are about to have a major auction regarding offshore wind and basically real estate that's in the sea that would be made available to offshore wind developers. So no, I think wind and solar and renewables generally, that's where much of the growth is going to be in the energy space. Not saying that natural gas is not important, or hydroelectric is not important, or nuclear is not important, but the growth will be probably wind and solar, and battery technologies also play a part in this.
Interesting. So do you see a lot of, and this is again sort of a bigger picture question, but one that I was specifically asked to ask you, and a friend of mine who's very much in this space asked, can we get a sense of, and do you have a sense of how much of the bill is going to go towards like big earth moving type projects, as opposed to maybe something that's a little bit more fluff, like painting Amtrak cars or something like that?
No, I think actually the infrastructure bill is pretty good in terms of really focusing on actual infrastructure. I mean, I remember in 2009, there was a stimulus package signed by President Obama in February of 2009 amidst the global financial crisis. And the notion was shovel-ready projects. But infrastructure is also very broadly defined under that package. There's roughly an $800 billion package, a bit short of that, and around $130 billion of that was for infrastructure. But a lot of that wasn't really infrastructure, as it turns out. I think, and you'll find some of that in this bill too, don't get me wrong. But, much of the money, is for roads and bridges, broadband, I mean, actual physical things, the electrical grid, and seaports and airports. So I think you'll see a lot of physical construction here. This is not just about reading stories to kids at night. I mean, that's not in the package, right? So I think there's something real here to this package, and it's $550 billion in new monies on top of additional monies that, that's why people talk about a $1.2 trillion stimulus package, or I should say infrastructure package, not stimulus. But the point is $550 billion of that is new money, and that's a big chunk. That's historic. So I think that this pushes America forward.
Interesting. So we see things like, as I look at breaking that down, especially like major like earth moving projects, that's like new buildings, that's new roads, that's new utility infrastructure, it's possibly new pipeline, it's all these types of things that the infrastructure bill will cover, and there's a healthy amount of money, in your opinion, allocated to that.
Well, I don't know how much I'll go to pipeline. Pipeline generally
Pipeline's a little dimmer.
Yeah, well, look, there's this feeling out there among some that pipeline construction is bad for the environment, right? That you don't want to move natural gas and oil around too aggressively, because that causes us to use more oil, more natural gas, and we want to get away from those fossil fuel technologies. At least some people think that way. Okay. And for the most part, pipeline is financed by the private sector, but also that construction is regulated by the public sector. So there's that. But you will see a lot of physical investment here, and I think it's quite positive. And a lot of these decisions will be made by state and local governments. It's not just about the federal government is providing a lot of money here, but ultimately state and local governments are making a lot of the decisions about how this capital will be deployed. And governors and mayors and county executives around the country, they like to cut ribbons. And when do you cut ribbons? When shovels go in the ground. Yeah. So I think you'll see a lot of shovels go in the ground.
That's exciting. I know for many. So as I'm working within the industry, I think one of the things that I have heard from so many stakeholders, principals in the industry, it's the growing complexity of business. It's the increasing amount of change that's happening, right? It's all around us. And the question is from your perspective as an economist, when these people sit down to plan their business for the next 5 years or 10 years, how should they be using economic data, information? I am going to ask you, by the way, to share how people can get in touch with you at the end. you may have some resources for them, but I don't know how much, the small to medium sized business really looks at, reading economic trends, understanding what's going to be happening. So it's a two-part question of how should I be incorporating the use of economic data into my planning of my business? And then two, what are the types of things that you think they should be specifically thinking about now? So let's talk about how they should use economic data. What do you recommend as best practices?
Yeah, I mean, profit equals revenue minus cost.
Right.
And on the cost side, you're talking about things like wages. I mean, so one of the things that one needs to really understand is labor market dynamics. How do I recruit? How do I retain my best workers? I mean, you mentioned earlier that sometimes people sell to one of their best employees or a group of their best employees. And every firm that's successful has a cluster of workers who are really effective. And in fact, sometimes those workers are quite young and may be the future owners of the enterprise. That's fine. But how do I make sure that they stay with me? How do I need to compensate them so that they don't get wanderlust and decide to want to work for one of my competitors, which is a double cost to me. So that's the kind of thing that's in the economy. We monitor things like average hourly earnings for all kinds of workers out there. People should monitor that. And the data are readily accessible from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, so that's an aspect of that. Of course, contractors have been dealing with these wildly fluctuating materials prices. So a lot of data out there about shipping costs, about the price of steel, aluminum, copper, concrete slabs, so on and so forth, other materials, diesel fuel. If you want to be a profit maximizer, you must be a cost minimizer. So what does my cost structure look like going forward, and what adjustments can I make to protect myself from future cost increases, whether entering in futures contracts or things that are less esoteric, but still inure to the benefit of my bottom line. Then, the revenue side, who are my competitors? Who's chipping away at my revenues? Who's undercutting me, underbidding me? How many firms are being formed in my segment of the economy? Those kinds of things also very important in making judgments about where to place the bid, in an environment in which often the low bid wins. You need to know something about your competitors. Some of that is actually reflected in the macroeconomic data. Competitor firms are also responding to these labor market shortages, for instance, these materials price increases. So if one understands these things better, then one has a better chance of being strategic and winning a disproportionate share of the market.
So ignorance is not bliss. So
no.
I'm going to paraphrase what I heard for our listeners, really, who are in this for the next 10 years. You need to start, when you look at a SWOT analysis, it's one of the most misused analysis I see out there, because, we're not going through the exercise with empirical data. We're going through it with feelings. And what you're recommending is really go read the data, go look at what are things like prevailing wage, right? What are the trends in material pricing over the next, what's the forecast? How many people are entering my market as competitors? These are things that you need to read the data and not just go off your hunch, because things are changing too fast. So what looks scary today may look great tomorrow. What looks great today may look scary tomorrow. And because of the rate of change, you've got to be reading the economic data to support your feelings. Anirban, I think that's kind of what I'm taking away. Is that tracking with what you're suggesting?
Yeah, that's it. I think, there are lots of forecasts out there, various things, lots of historical data that people can extrapolate. And it's, I think, very useful. And I speak to a lot of contractors who are very thoughtful about social change and changes in the underlying economy. I mean, they think about these things, and they probably don't misuse their SWOT analyses. By the way, sometimes your biggest risk is not in the data, right? The biggest risk is you lose your banking relationship or your insurance relationship, right? So you got to take those folks out to lunch too. So there's all kinds of things to do, but pay attention to trends, the mega trends. For instance, right now with the virus, one of the things that we saw right away was an enormous increase in work among HVAC contractors. Why? Because virus can spread through air handling systems. So, one of the things I did was earlier in the pandemic, I bought stock in Johnson Controls because they make some of this equipment, and that stock price took off. But the reason I did that is because I recognized that, my goodness, people are starting to put a lot of money and pay a lot of attention to these HVAC systems and upgrading them so that when the workers come back, they'll feel safer and then in fact be safer. So, if you're a mechanical contractor, for instance, that's the kind of phenomenon you want to think about and also use in your marketing. So if you go to a Class B office building owner and say, look, tenants are really on the move right now. A lot of people are not renewing their leases, but they might need some space. They might use less space than they used to, but they might be looking your direction for competitive pricing on rent. One of the things you need to do is make sure that your common areas look and feel safe, that your air handling systems are modern. Let me help you with some of that. And that's the kind of thing where you can use the economic data, not just to make personal investments, but also to drive the business and to drive marketing.
Interesting. So it's looking at it inside those trends. Where is the biggest bulk or pool of investment going to be made or services needed? And so I think that's going to help most of these organizations think, what do I really want to build my company to be in the next 10 years? And it sounds like you're saying this is a major trend that's not going away anytime soon.
Yeah, I think remodeling of existing structures is a big trend. So, when you've got so much vacant retail space, what's going to happen? People are going to rethink how to use that space. Is it for data centers? Is it for an outpatient medical clinic? Is it for affordable housing? But, the space will be adaptively reused because a lot of that existing retail is in really nice, centrally located, visible locations.
Right.
But it just doesn't, that location no longer supports retail because of Jeff Bezos and Amazon and other phenomenon, the success of Walmart and Target and gobbling up market share as well. So in any case, there's that, same thing with office buildings, lots of underutilized office buildings. So we've seen in Baltimore, for instance, a lot of those underutilized office buildings downtown have been turned into apartments. What else could they be used as? I don't know. But the point is lots of adaptive reuse, lots of repositioning of properties, and that generates work for contractors.
Man, that really is a good idea. I hope our listeners catch this, but I think you've got to be thinking about the adaptive reuse. There's going to be a lot of that. I can't tell you how many office space owners I've talked to have said, we got 1 million square feet available. These are bigger organizations. They're like, we got 1 million square feet available. Nobody seems to be interested. We'll give it away. And maybe the answer is for some construction companies to approach those owners, those portfolios and say, have you considered adaptive reuse? And here are some ideas around that, right? Because there's a massive demand over here for additional outpatient services versus what you're using it for, which is office or retail. So I think that could be a very creative conversation inside a lot of construction organizations. How do I sell my construction services? How do I sell my maintenance and support services? And it seems like you could really look through just about any trade and come up with some unique answers. So I really like that idea. Anirban, one of the things that, I think is so fascinating is the more we get into the conversation, there's always it's almost like splitting atoms, right? You think you've gotten down to the core elements and then there's more. But I'd really like to kind of take a big picture here for a second and wrap up with two things. Number one, which is what, if you look back 10 years and you think about where the construction industry was, how much has changed in the last 10 years? And then as you look forward to the next 10 years, could you paint a picture of what the world's going to look like through the lens of construction? So I'd really like people to kind of get, and you've been at this a while. You really have the benefit of time in the market and seeing all of this. So I'd like to kind of get your perspective looking back 10 years and then what you see the world looking like for construction in the future.
I'll tell you, I don't see a lot of change over the past 10 years. In fact, I don't see a lot of change over the past 100 years. Not that I've seen all of that, but the point is, construction executives once in a while will tell me, the last great revolution in construction was the advent of structural steel, which happened more than a century ago. But if you look at the typical construction job site today, it doesn't look that different from what it might have looked like in the 30s and 40s, right? You've got people standing around, some people working with equipment, lunch pails, hard hats, so on and so forth. And yes, the cranes are more impressive and those kinds of things. The materials are more resilient. But overall, we haven't seen the real revolution. I think the next 10 years, you'll see a phenomenal amount of change. And again, necessity is the mother of invention. So we don't have enough workers. And we're going to have lots of retirement of workers going forward. I mean, this is not over. And so again, there's going to be this push toward adapting new technologies and processes. Processes meaning things like modularization and prefabrication. It's been shown that millennials like to be comfortable, right? They don't want to stress themselves too much, right? They got to look good for their Instagram posts. And so in that environment, they often want to work in, or in that context, they want to work in controlled settings. And manufacturing or that prefabrication setting can offer that controlled setting where they're not exposed, for instance, to warm temperatures or very cold temperatures, that kind of thing, or rain. And so I think you'll see more construction come indoors, but you'll see other changes to construction as well. So I don't know if it's next decade that the revolution transpires, but it starts this decade. And the firms that embrace the newest technologies and the most productive processes will survive and grow, but you're going to see a lot of firm deaths over the course of the decade as well.
So are we going to see robots replacing workers on job sites in the next 10 years?
Oh, I think so. I mean, already you have robots that can lay brick. Now, they're not that effective in terms of doing corners yet and those kinds of things, and they're very expensive to purchase. But we know, as we've seen with electric vehicles and other technologies, that cost curve goes down over time, right? Exactly. And all of a sudden, market penetration becomes much more significant. And I think you're going to see that with robotics. That's one of the technologies that stands to replace human beings in large numbers, driverless vehicles as well. So again, necessity is the mother of invention. We're in a country that has slowed its immigration dramatically over the course of time. As I say, a lot of construction workers historically have been immigrants. This was true in the 19th century, the 20th century, and into the 21st century. So this is nothing new. But with immigration slowing and the birth rates having been so soft in recent decades, we're not going to have enough workers in many industries, but certainly construction is one of them. So technology is going to have to displace or replace those workers, and I think it will.
It's interesting. So, and again, it's not, I almost wonder if it's replace or nobody wants to do the job anymore. And it's either stop building or hire robots. So I see that as something. So we're going to see trends where you're going to see buildings, the construction of the prefabrication happening in controlled environments. We're going to see machines doing the work that humans were doing. They may not, they're probably not cyborgs looking exactly like humans, but being computers. They're just machines that do the work that a worker did. The bricklaying machine probably does not look like a human. Fair. So it comes down to, what is going to make one construction company unique over another if they're all using, generally speaking, the same technology, right? What's going to make them different or unique? Will construction companies have to incorporate more in terms of, architecture and the drawings and the development, or will we see that trend where the construction company also becomes the developer, or not so much? That won't be a trend.
I know many construction executives who dabble in real estate, that's true, but by and large, developers, that's very specialized work. It's financial in nature. It depends upon a separate set of banking relationships, for instance. It's about getting permits and zoning modifications, those kinds of things. And so I don't think you see, it's hard enough to run a construction firm without trying to be a developer, and vice versa. So, I think you will see this ongoing pattern where we have more architects employed by construction firms. So, notion of design build, but in a different sense here, you will see that kind of vertical integration between architectural firms, for instance, and contractors, so that, it's a one-stop shop for the project owner. You can do your design and the construction work in one place, one contract. And so I think you'll see more of that, but development is very difficult. In fact, I think if I had to do it over again, I would have been a real estate developer, because they seem to have a lot of fun and they also seem to drive very nice cars.
So, hey, it's never too late, Anirban. What do we think in terms of generally about things like margins in the industry? Do we think they'll stay stable where they are today, or do we see increased amounts of people entering the construction market? I think if depending on who you talk to, it's a very thin margin business and very competitive. So I'm wondering if we'll see competition increase or decrease over the next 10 years.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Now, I mean, I can tell you in the near term, that margins will be roughly flat. And the reason I say that is I'm averaging two things out. So one of the things I do, I'm the chief economist for Associated Builders and Contractors, also the Construction Financial Management Association, and we sometimes poll our members regarding what's going on in construction. And one of the things that we ask them is, what's going on with your profit margins? And many of them have told us that they expect their margins to actually increase over the next 6 months, which shocks me because I think with materials price and labor costs rising so rapidly, that in fact margins will be flat or worse. But that's what a lot of contractors are saying. No, it's going to be, we have so much work and we have pricing power because people expect the bids to rise. I mean, they've built inflation to their expectations now. And so we're able to push prices up a little bit faster. And so we're able to at least keep margins stable, which is interesting to me. Now, over the next 10 years, I would think that margins are going to go up, but here's why. I think margins are going to go up because productivity is going to go up. And again, this fits in neatly with this story of technology and changing processes and productivity enhancements. So when you can do more with fewer people, you become more profitable. And I think, and you've seen, of course, in manufacturing and retail and many other segments of the economy, financial services. You haven't seen that to the same extent in construction, which is more dependent upon labor, it would seem, than ever before.
Right.
Can't work through the jobs. I mean, right now we have around 400,000 available unfilled construction jobs in America. It's pretty high.
Wow.
I think what you'll see is eventually this technological revolution takes over, costs fall, margins go up.
Interesting. So, it makes me wonder, where do they turn to? And this may not be the right question for you. This may not be your area of expertise, but where do these construction companies turn to just to figure out, with all of the technology, it's a little bit of, you get all these ideas and new companies out there that are providing things to managing your job front to back, your CRM, robotics on jobs, all these different things that you have to, where do they go to figure out what they need now and what they can put off, for another year or two? Where do they go for that?
Well, look, there's no simple answer to that question, right? But I think the most obvious thing to do is look at what your strongest competitor is doing. And if there's somebody in the market that is actually outdoing one, whose performance is better financially or otherwise than one's own firm, then ask the question, what are they doing differently? And there's probably some interesting nuggets there.
So yeah, taking a look at your competition, not just putting blinders on, based on your work in this field, is there anything that's caught your attention in the last, in the last year that you've seen people starting to do as it relates to adapting technology to their business?
Yeah, I see more construction firms calling themselves technology firms that happen to be in construction.
Interesting.
And you hear that about some of the most successful firms. So Tesla, many people characterize Tesla as a technology firm that happens to be in battery and electric vehicles, those segments, right? But they're about the cutting edge. And they would be about the cutting edge, whatever segment they're in, whether it's rocketry or whatever it happens to be. Elon Musk will be at the cutting edge. And I think firms want to be at the cutting edge, at least in terms of deploying technology efficiently and effectively. And so I hear more of that from executives thinking about technology, thinking about the revolution to come. And so it's going to come. And again, some firms are going to be driving that revolution and other firms are going to fall by the wayside because they're just going to be outcompeted.
Yeah, and looking at your competitors, in some case, letting them, if it's super cutting edge, maybe should they let the outlier cut their teeth first, make their mistakes, and kind of wait and see how well it works, or should they dive right in and be more open to trying new things?
No, often it makes sense to wait. Actually, so often the earliest adopters don't fare the best, because as you say, that's where you have to train your workforce. There are errors, there's loss of reputation, all kinds of things. So sometimes it makes sense to be the second adopter, but not the last adopter. If you're the last adopter, you're probably out of business, right? So,
right.
But again, this is very hypothetical, right? So it depends on the technology, so on and so forth. But yeah, sometimes it makes sense to not be the first one in, but then to look very carefully at those folks who are the early adopters, see how they're faring, and then make judgments based on that.
Interesting. So I'm going to sum up a couple of things. One, be a technology firm that happens to be in construction, be watching what the market is doing. You don't necessarily have to be first, but you definitely don't want to be on the other side of the bell curve, on the last side, right? So you don't need to be the innovator, but you probably want to be more in that early adopter to mid adopter on technologies that you see trending in your space. we're not going to see labor. As a matter of fact, it sounds like we're going to see crunches in labor as the existing labor force retires, immigration slowed already, demand up. We don't see schools and universities necessarily specializing in labor for the market. There are trade schools, but generally what I'm hearing you say is the trends is we're going to have to find creative ways to supplement what people used to do because we're not going to have enough of them. We're going to see a lot of growth in areas like hospital construction. You're going to see growth in dining, different types of dining, probably more, the Dunkin' Donuts and the like in the world. We're also going to see in the other industries, you're seeing things like if you're in HVAC, retrofitting existing buildings that might be used for commercial office. We're going to see those retrofitted over time. We're going to see retail retrofitted over time due to demands in those areas. The infrastructure bill you're seeing as being a very good thing for the construction community, and that it's going to be pretty widespread in terms of the distribution of dollars. When we do see wind and solar being something, and major earth moving projects as being things that are very much included in this bill. And if you're in those areas, it might be good to double down. And in the next 10 years, we're going to see more change than in the last 100. Is that right?
I think that's possible. Yeah, that's actually possible, in part because technology is moving so quickly. But the bigger factor probably is that construction just hasn't changed that quickly over the last century. Now, some people will say to me, oh, we've had design build and we have BIM and so on. So, okay, fine. I'm not saying that it has been a period of complete stagnation, but you look at the data on productivity in construction, it lags. Productivity growth in construction lags almost every other major industry. So not much has changed.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. And so you really want to make sure, I think, one of my thoughts here is that your leadership team must really have the opportunity, and part of what your work is when it comes to your strategy for your company, have small teams that can look at economic trends, changes in the industry, pressure, sources of change that are more permanent or lasting, and have maybe small clusters of folks that are committees to assess this, maybe through it's a SWOT analysis or whatever, to figure out where you need to position your company moving forward in terms of things like technology, in terms like reading the macro trends in labor, materials costs, things like this, and being nimble enough to make sound decisions and then carry those out through the organization. That's going to be important. Anirban, thank you so much for being with us. I'd like to, people are going to have more questions. This is designed to really tease out some things that people should take action on or to be thinking about. How would people get in touch with you, and what types of resources might you have for the construction industry, for those who don't know?
Right. Well, I'm writing articles constantly for various publications, the Construction Executive Magazine, for instance, on behalf of our members at ABC and the Construction Financial Management Association. So there's that. But I have a Substack post, basu.substack.com, where I also do a lot of analysis regarding construction, the broader macroeconomy. I try to put some humor into it and try to keep these pieces pithy. That's why I really try to keep our readers up to date on what's going on in the economy, what to watch for, what's likely to happen with softwood lumber or with the labor market or whatever it happens to be, what's the Federal Reserve up to, and what does it mean for them to increase rates as much as 4 times or 5 times this year, if that's what's about to happen. So, wow. Look, 2022 is going to be a very interesting year for the economy. I suppose you could say that about every year, but some years are pretty dull. I mean, tell me, what was 2015 like? You can't remember because it wasn't that interesting.
No.
But 2021 you'll remember, and I think 2022 will be memorable too for various reasons. So that's the kind of thing we write. basu.substack.com.
Excellent. And if somebody wanted you to come in, speak to their organization about this, or maybe even executive team, is that an option? Can they get in touch with you through that connection, that link you just provided?
Yeah, absolutely. And reach out and can schedule an appearance. I speak more than 200 times a year in various fora. A lot of my speaking lately has been by webinar, as it turns out. But nonetheless, happy to address membership organizations, but also individual enterprises.
Well, fantastic. And I know that, last time we spent time together on topics like this in front of an audience, it was in person, and you absolutely owned the room. And I saw so many notes being taken. You didn't disappoint in this very short podcast. And I'm so appreciative for that, and for our friendship, and for all the help you provide to the construction community. So everybody will provide the contact information along with this podcast. I encourage you to get the resources that Anirban has to offer and incorporate that into your plan, because I think what we're all in agreement on is change in the next 10 years is going to be greater than at any time you've seen in your career. So with that, Anirban, thank you. Thank you for being here with us, and thank you for sharing your wisdom, your knowledge, and everything on construction.
Thanks bunches, Matt. It was a privilege.
Great. Well, thank you. Privilege was mine. So for everyone who's listening, thanks for joining the revolution. And as you know, you're either going to participate, or as Anirban's told you, you might be on the sidelines faster than you thought. Pay attention, stay sharp, read everything Anirban writes, and to your success. Thanks, everybody.